Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you. Thank you to Joshua for putting this session together and handling the technology. Thank you to EDGE, a remarkable group within the United Church, for inviting me to this session. I want to thank each of you who are part of this call, thank you for becoming the kind of person you are, that you would even be interested in participating, let alone what you will do with it later. And I also want to acknowledge all of the people who may watch this as a video without much opportunity to talk about it. I hope you do find people to talk with you about this experience. I want to think with you about living with post-despair hope. This has been my experience for most of my life. I fell into serious thinking about the future as an undergraduate at Queen's. I organized what may have been the first formal Futures Conference in 1960. Diefenbaker was still the Prime Minister of Canada. It seems like lifetimes ago. That means that I've spent my life thinking and reading and talking with other people and exploring the question of just what kind of a species are we, what kind of a culture do we live in, what kind of futures are implicit in the cultures that we live in. And of course, when I fell into this work, we were all excited by the openness of the future, John Kennedy and then Pierre Trudeau, and the 60s, and now not so much. And so by post-despair hope, what I mean is a hope that is vibrant enough, that is grounded enough, that rather than denying despair, rather than fleeing from despair, it can actually engage and cope with despair and survive the experience. I have found that in our officially optimistic modern cultures, that most optimism and even much of the hope that is expressed does not withstand its first serious encounter with despair. It's like dew on a spring morning. It's there if you're out early enough, but by the time the sun is up at 10 o'clock, the dew has vanished. And so what I have become interested and committed to is a hope that lies beyond despair. Now, I'm known as a hopeful pessimist. It's a language that I use. It emerged because I was doing a workshop. This is half a lifetime ago for me, early 40s in Toronto at a Catholic conference center that had been a convent. And one of the nuns came up to me afterwards and said, Ruben, I know what you are. And that scared me because males are not supposed to reveal their deepest selves in public. And I thought, boy, I'm in trouble. And she smiled and said, you're a hopeful pessimist. And it didn't take many heartbeats for me to realize that she was quite right. And I said, sister, I've not used that language before, but I will think about it and own it. And it does describe me well. Let me explain why. We're all familiar with hope and hopelessness. If you're hopeless, it's kind of like a flat tire, that all the air has gone out. That if you're in bed, there's no reason to get out of bed. If you're out of bed, there's no reason to get in bed. In fact, there's not much reason to do anything at all because the situation you're in is hopeless and all life energy is dissipated. Whereas if you're hopeful, one of the things it does for you is it actually brings energy, that you're ready to engage, you're ready to stay in that struggle. Now, that is not entirely a blessing. It's like many of the blessings in this life, they're fairly mixed because you may have energy to engage with a situation that everybody else thinks is hopeless. And so for me, though, the hope that I seek and the hope that I seek to nourish in myself and others is a genuine, deep hopefulness. Václav Havel said, hope is an ability to work for something because it is good, not because it stands a chance to succeed. If I could ask Joshua and Sarah and whoever has their cameras on just to turn them off, because at least for me, they're getting in the way of the picture. What you see on the right-hand side is demographics of Russia. And on the left-hand side, it's 1990. The right-hand side is 1912. So it's a whole generation. And what you see is that the birth rate drops like a brick and the death rate increases like a rocket. And this is what happened when the USSR collapsed as a regional empire. And you got to remember, people at that time had only known the USSR. I mean, if you're young, that's all you've known. It's all your parents have known. It's even all your grandparents have basically known, although if they're old enough, some of them would have vague memories of Tsarist Russia. And it's not just that your personal world collapses, literally your society collapses around you. And understandable that young people would decide this is not a fit world to bring people into, and the birth rate drops, and it takes a long time to come back. And the death rate goes up because for the first time, what you've had is an orderly command and control society where men whose job is to get out into the fields and dig the potatoes and get them to the trucks, to get them to the train, to get them to Moscow, didn't have to get up. There's nobody to tell them that. And therefore, they literally, large numbers of them lay in bed and drank themselves to death. If you look at the demographics of Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the population goes down by several million people. It is a dramatic drop. Optimist and pessimist. For me, that sense of optimism, which in our culture is official, that if you're an official of the culture, if you're even official heading a committee of some kind, you're supposed to be optimistic. It's a requirement that we're a culture that doesn't tolerate much pessimism. And we do that, we maintain that by turning every challenge into a problem. And the beauty of problems is problems have solutions. And the beauty of a solution is that once you have a solution, the problem is gone. And so it's wiped from the face of the earth. And so we live in a culture that everybody is solution-oriented, but with this fantasy that every condition in life can be wiped from the earth. Where pessimists know that in fact, much of life is a condition and not a problem. And conditions are things you have to learn to face and engage and explore and cope with. Conditions don't go away. Life itself is not a problem, it's a condition. If you have a son who is schizophrenic, that's not a problem, it's a condition. And so while life itself may be a comedy, pessimists know that it includes tragic experiences that may take the life out of you, at least for a while. And that overall, the journey may ask more of us than we are prepared to give. And that's true of whole cultures. That whole cultures in human history have collapsed because the culture itself did not have the capacity to adapt to new conditions. And so to understand the human challenge that we're up against, we can turn to Albert Einstein. Einstein said, you have to learn the rules of the game, and then you have to play better than anyone else. You can think of all cultures as, in fact, meeting this challenge, that what a culture is, whether today or at any time in history, at any place on the planet, a culture, in effect, is a way for humans to play the game of life. When you're born into a culture that's a going concern. It has language, it has rules as to who you should respect and who you can get away with not respecting, of what you do to earn a good reputation. And there's pressure to play the game well. But what most cultures don't do is invite you to actually sit back and think about, what game am I or are we actually playing? And they certainly don't invite you to think about, is our game the same game as the game we're actually in? And so I'm making a distinction here between the game that our culture is playing, our modern techno-industrial culture, which, as we all know, is a game of economic growth, a game of economic competition, a game of acquisition, a game of earning status by what you own and what power. It's a game at which at its heart there is a marriage of money and power. But the game you're actually in is a game that is determined by the big forces of history and by the forces of the ecology of the time and place that you're in. And we know that both of those things change. And so cultures collapse when they run into a situation that the game they were in when the culture was formed is no longer the game that is emerging around them, which is, of course, the situation that we see ourselves in today. And so the question can be asked of where are we placing our bets? Where are we? Where are we modern techno-industrial people? We're not the largest group of cultures on the planet, but we are the most powerful and the richest and the ones with the loudest voices. And the interesting thing is that of the various alternative futures that we face, the one that we've placed virtually all our money on is the need to extend our modern techno-industrial culture to the ends of the earth. And yes, we want to make it more equitable. And yes, we want to make it sustainable. So that within that white circle that I've drawn there, our modern techno-industrial culture, we are investing literally hundreds of billions of dollars around the world in universities and think tanks and research centers and corporations to extend modernity, make it more equitable, but make it sustainable. And that's the only bet that you will be offered by political parties. There is no political party that offers any version of the future other than that. That includes the Greens. The Green New Deal is within that space, as is a more niggardly view of someone like Jason Kenney, who is my premier in Alberta, who values, quite openly, values money over persons. But that debate between conservatives on the right and the Green and the left is a debate within that framework. It's not a debate about the framework. There is no political party yet that is willing to stand outside that framework. There's no political party yet that says, whether we like it or not, folks, we are in a long and irrevocable decline that we need to learn to manage. And we are the party of managed decline. And certainly there's no political party yet that says, whether we like it or not, modernity is on a path, has become lethal in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries, and now is on a path to death. And so these kind of stories, this is just a particular report done in June, report of a group, but this kind of thing is increasingly common if you know where to look for it. But I want to dwell on two comments made by Dennis Meadows. I assume that most of you have heard of Dennis Meadows and his extraordinary wife, Donella, who is now dead. Dennis and Donella are systems thinkers, dynamic systems thinkers, people who devoted their life to the question of how would we even imagine, let alone know the world that we're in if we want to know it deeply and authentically and in a way that in fact enhances human life and life on the planet. They were deeply involved in the Limits to Growth study that was put together in the late 1960s and reported in the early 1970s. And he's talking here last month with Danielle Wall, who's also an interesting person. If you don't know him, you might Google him. That the notion that there's some kind of fairly attractive, sustainable society ahead of us, if we can only find it, is now a fantasy. The global population, its use of materials, its generation of waste has grown so far above the sustainable capacity of the planet that there's nothing ahead of the kind that the sustainable utopia people are talking about. Now, don't be fooled by his language of sustainable utopia people there. He's not talking about some funny subset of sustainability science. He's talking about the whole of sustainability science if you read the whole interview, which is on Danielle Wall's website. What he's saying is that the sustainability industry, which is the big hope for the future, that we are now, every political party is proclaiming, every chamber of commerce, every parent to their children, that that's a fantasy and it's not going to happen. He goes on to say he spent 50 years trying to help people understand their realistic options, choosing a bit more wisely for the long term. I would say that by and large, I have failed. I don't think the planet is going to evolve any different from my having been around than it would have if I had not been conceived. Now, that's a terrible thing for any human being to have to say, that the ways they have devoted their life to making a difference and making the future better has entirely been a failure and made no difference. And yet, if you actually look at the response, if you look at the degree to which we as modern cultures and people, what we have learned in the last 50 years, that's my working lifetime. The answer is not enough to save the future. So there is now and will be despair. It will be despair in orders of magnitude that we haven't even imagined yet. There is no significant person, there's no university president that I know of, no bishop of any church, no leader of a political party, no corporate leader who is willing to talk honestly in public about where the data is taking us. That means not only do we face despair, but we face despair unprepared. And it's already been acknowledged that I live in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta. One of the creatures that lives near me are grizzly bears. And one of the things we know about grizzly bears, rattlesnakes, and human beings, that when you startle us, we tend to behave badly. And so we're setting ourselves up not only for despair, but for societal chaos in a way that is needless. And so as a hopeful pessimist, what at least can we begin to do? Where do you cut into this that might help to make the kind of differences that Dennis Meadows says we need to make and he hasn't been able to make? And the place that I'm increasingly coming down is this, that the root question facing us as a civilization, as our modern form of civilization, is to ask and get clear about which experiences have I, have you, have we taken as those that reveal the deepest and most coherent clues about the nature of the universe. Because one of the ways to conceive any culture is that it's a human response to what the people in that culture over time have taken as, this is who we are as persons, this is the nature of the reality we're engaged with, and therefore this is how we have to live. And it's interesting that we live in a universe that all it gives us is clues. It doesn't give us such blindingly obvious data that any fool can answer this question. The ancient Hebrew word Torah, which we tend to translate as law, so we see the Torah, the 10 commandments, as commandments. The actual root sense of Torah is clue. These are the 10 clues to a good life, but they're only clues. There's lots of evidence to the contrary. And so the question is, for each of us, in the deepest and most significant experiences of our life, which are the ones that we will take as revealing what the universe is about? And I can tell you, it came to me because I had a heart attack. That's another story we don't have time for. I was 34, but I ended up with 6 weeks in the foothills, in the residence of the Foothills Hospital in Calgary, because Air Canada wouldn't let me fly. And there was not much to do except eat, sleep, and meditate in the Foothills Chapel. And what came to me is that love, grace, forgiveness, and beauty are the sea on which I float, which hold my body. That the most fundamental word about reality is not that I engage it, but that it holds me. And so our choices are to trust the experiences that are taught to us by our culture, that money and power trump all else, or trust the experiences which now transcend both ourselves and our culture. That is, that call into question not just our culture in the way that we fight for social justice, but call into question our own modern selves, modern constructs of ourselves, our own aspirations, our own identities. And that side of the social justice movement we're not nearly as good at. And so that first question, as I've suggested, here are some of the things that for me are soul restoring. Heather and I quite deliberately have about every 10 days have taken a day to explore some of the foothills that we live in of the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. We do that to restore our soul. We restore our soul in other ways as well. But we understand that the work of restoring our soul so that we can both stay at work in a culture that is under increasing pressure. Heather works as a neonatal intensive care nurse, so she literally lives with life and death every day, with grieving and frightened parents. And the second question then is, if it is the case that we are finding grounds for hope beyond despair, will I, will you, will we join with others to commit to the struggle to faithfully embody what has been revealed to me, to you, to us by our own deepest experiences? Will we live a life that incarnates the insight, the revelation about what reality is finally about? And that challenge is more profound, in my view, in the 21st century than it even was in the 20th. And remember that the 20th century to date is the most bloody century in human history. And so I don't say this lightly. It's these things that allow me, as a hopeful pessimist, as someone who seeks hope beyond despair, to go in peace, to face despair, and to love with hope. I invite you to sit in silence. As noted, you will find yourself shortly in a room with two others. Pay attention now to what is stirring within you, not to what I've said, but what is stirring in you. And then take turns in your small group to speak briefly about just even one thing that is stirring within you, so that you have a conversation. And then after 10 or 12 minutes, we'll come back to the large room and pick up some of that. Thank you.